Masculinity has been in a crisis of various sorts depending on who you talk to. Some people think it's largely been lost, while others rail against toxic masculinity. And there's also a growing awareness of the crisis of how young men are falling behind. There are roughly 4 billion men on the planet and 8 billion judges. There's room for all of these situations to coexist. Today we're going to talk about these problems and where we go from here. But first, what is it that makes up masculinity? Does it have one true or best form? What are its parts? What are its various forms? First, some terminology. Masculinity is a set of attributes, behaviors, and roles generally associated with men and boys. So there's this basket of traits that we're going to talk about throughout the podcast, like strength, leadership, courage, emotional restraint, competitiveness and dominance, independence and self-sufficiency, and the provider-protector role. These are considered masculine traits. But first, let's go back to Aristotle. Aristotle believed that ethical virtue is a disposition to choose the mean between two vices. For example, courage is the mean between cowardice, or deficiency of courage, and recklessness, the excess of courage. See, the golden mean isn't exactly a fixed point, it's more of a relative concept. It really varies depending on the specific situation and the individual. It requires practical wisdom and experience to find the appropriate course of action. Beyond individual actions, the concept of the golden mean extends beyond to encompass broader ethical and societal norms, promoting balance and harmony in various aspects of life. And it's not necessarily the point exactly between two extremes. Sometimes virtuous action will be closer to one extreme than the other, depending on the context. Coming back to people being able to judge if something is a virtue or a vice. So what is this about forms of masculinity? The first one we're going to talk about is hegemonic masculinity. And hegemonic masculinity is a concept in gender studies that refers to the dominant and idealized form of masculinity in a given society at a particular time. It's not necessarily the most common way men actually behave, but rather the culturally exalted form of manhood that sets the standard for how real men are expected to act. Key characteristics often associated with hegemonic masculinity include aggression or violence, right? This willingness to use physical force or assertiveness. Emotional suppression, the idea that men should be stoic and not show vulnerability or feminine emotions. Competitiveness and achievement, a drive to succeed and dominate others, often in professional or athletic spheres. Self-reliance and independence. This is manifested often as a desire to not ask for help or rely on other people, which can also turn into a desire to not want to help other people. Heterosexuality. Traditionally, hegemonic masculinity has been strongly linked to being heterosexual. This goes hand in hand with dominance over women. Hegemonic masculinity legitimizes men's power and privilege over women. Hierarchy among men. Hegemonic masculinity also establishes this hierarchy among different forms of masculinity, where those who don't conform to the hegemonic ideal are often marginalized or subordinated. So this comes back to this competitiveness and achievement, the drive to succeed or dominate others. If you've got the most, you are hegemonic. It's important to note that hegemonic masculinity is not static, like all masculinity. It changes across cultures, societies, and historical periods. It's also not something that all men fully embody, but rather an ideal that influences cultural expectations and behaviors. Other forms of masculinity. The concept of hegemonic masculinity acknowledges that there are multiple masculinities that exist in a society, often in relation to the hegemonic form. These can include complicit masculinity. Complicit masculinity is men who don't fully enact the hegemonic masculinity, because again, it's an ideal that not everyone can achieve, But these men still benefit from the patriarchal system that it upholds. They may not actively oppress women, but they also don't challenge the existing gender order. There's also subordinated masculinity, forms of masculinity that are devalued or marginalized by hegemonic masculinity. This often includes gay men or men who express traits perceived as feminine, like emotional sensitivity. They may face stigma, discrimination, or even violence. Next, we have marginalized masculinity. These masculinities exist at the fringes of society, often influenced by factors like race, class, disability, or socioeconomic status. Men in these groups may experience additional barriers and be seen as less masculine compared to the hegemonic ideal. Then there's protest masculinity. This is a form of masculinity often found in working class or ethnically marginalized communities that embodies similar claims to power as hegemonic masculinity, but often lack the economic resources or institutional authority to achieve it, sometimes leading to more overt displays of aggression or resistance, excessive competition, or dominance over women. Some of what we see today as toxic masculinity. And then there are alternative masculinities, sometimes referred to as inclusive or egalitarian masculinities. These are emerging forms that actively challenge the dominant, often toxic norms of traditional masculinity. They emphasize traits like emotional intelligence, cooperation, vulnerability, empathy, and shared responsibilities. Examples of this include nurturing fatherhood or men actively involved in feminist movements. These masculinities aim to promote equality and create more flexible and diverse understandings of what it means to be a man. And as I alluded to before, there's also the concept that these different types of masculinity exist within a hierarchy. This refers to the idea that societies often rank men based on their conformity to dominant cultural ideals of manhood, traditionally known as hegemonic masculinity. This hierarchy places some men in positions of power and privilege, while others are marginalized or subordinated. The impact of this hierarchy can lead to power dynamics, where this hierarchy reinforces power imbalances between men and women and between men themselves. It can be felt in social stratification, where men who embody hegemonic masculinity are afforded more social status and opportunities. It can impact mental health. The pressure to conform to hegemonic masculinity can negatively impact men's mental health and well-being. Understanding this hierarchy is crucial for social movements seeking to challenge gender inequality, promote inclusive and equitable models of masculinity, and help young men and women adapt to the modern era. Now on to toxic masculinity. To be honest, many of these behaviors were the norm in the last century. Toxic masculinity is a real issue. But I think the subculture promoting this as a valid lifestyle has gotten outsized attention. Anecdotally, in speaking with my boys, they know who the purveyors of modern toxic masculinity are, and they tend to think they're kind of a joke. I'd like to think the amount and quality of time I've spent with them had something to do with their wisdom. There must be other parents out there doing a good job because they said this is the dominant understanding between people that they know about purveyors of toxic masculinity. I think the outsized attention some of these people are getting can be somewhat problematic, right? It has its own risk in shining such a spotlight on these people. It gives them a larger platform. It feeds also into this common message young men are seeing today that men, and to be honest, especially white men, are the root of society's problems. While it is true that white men in general, and white men specifically, have had a very outsized share of positions of power for a long time in the history of humanity, that isn't necessarily the case anymore. And we can't put the sins of our ancestors on the 75% or more of today's men that don't have the same advantages because the world has moved on. They're being told that men, which they identify as, are the root of the society's problems. They should shut up because we've heard enough from white men about what problems are and how to solve them. I do a lot of canvassing, political canvassing, and during Get Out the Vote time, one of the things we do once we've identified someone that we would like to vote is we tell them, I know you're a reliable voter. People tend to live up to the halos we provide to them. A lot of them will understand where the message is coming from and the impact that our history has on us today, and they can get over it. But we're also going to push some of these people away, that we need to understand that they have real problems too. They aren't the source of the problems we're suffering from now. They're dealing with it just like everybody else. As we mentioned before about protest masculinity, I think that's really where toxic masculinity fits in, right? These young men today don't have the ability that society expects them to have to easily be a provider, be a protector, be an exemplar in their community, and not being able to live up to the ideals in those regards. They shift extra effort into protecting their identity as masculine into these forms of dominance over women and aggression in general and complete resistance of whatever is going on with them emotionally. Masculinity is lost. But wait, we've been here before. This isn't the first decade. This isn't the first century that we've talked about masculinity being lost. I think the bigger problem is the lack of nuance and understanding masculinity that's lost in modern culture. As we already mentioned, the societal view of the ideal hegemonic masculinity is an ideal few can attain, right? By its very nature, competitiveness and being the best and being dominant. Not everybody can be dominant. Not everybody can win. So the traditional concept of hegemonic masculinity and how we view some of those traits excludes people by definition. And the basket of traits comprising masculinity is shifted over the centuries. Definitely these persistent core traits have shifted in the ideal application, right? How we view some of these things in the 1700s versus the 1800s versus the 21st century, how we view what strength is or what emotional restraint is, has certainly changed to adapt to the times. But there are traditions. And traditions, while they are peer pressure from dead people, they're not always bad, but they are always slow to change with the times, especially ones that we don't view as often with a critical eye, like masculinity and how that changes based on how society changes and how men fit into society. The joy of it now is we are society. We get to help determine what masculinity means to us, and how we identify those specific traits and what we want our ideal or our ideals of masculinity to be, because I don't think the ideal is everyone is a certain way. There are times where the traditional hegemonic ideal may be good for a leader of a culture, but there may be other times where cooperation is prized more than competition, and maybe you don't want the traditional hegemonic masculinity exemplar to be the leader of your company or your organization or your nation. Now, in getting to determine what masculinity is as a society and as an individual, you may be swimming against the current in some cases. The typical traditional masculine traits are going to tend to get a good response from the traditional female, but you should still be yourself. It's the only way you'll find your tribe. If things aren't working for you and you're opening to exploring a different way of being masculine or a different way to express your identity in whatever phase of life you're in, you should do it. It's the only way you're going to find the people that you need to find and be happy being yourself. Especially with modern technology reshaping the world, there's a greater case than ever for viewing human behavior in general through a larger multidimensional spectrum of masculine and feminine traits. There's always going to be examples of the extremes one way or another, and there'll always be plenty of room to thrive somewhere in between. A solid case can be made for the healthiest expression of one's humanity It doesn't exist on either end of the extremes, right? This could be another application for the golden mean. I think what's lost isn't masculinity itself, it's our view of masculinity is lost, which helps make it harder for young men to develop the character and identity and purpose that they can fulfill to lead a happy, productive life in society. Both our understanding of what that is and the scaffolding we have to help raise young men to understand what that is, to find what parts of that they are best suited for and how they can best exist in the world. And that is a big part of why men are falling behind. Look at key indicators across men and women are particularly grim. For men, the rates of depression, drug abuse, suicide, achievement in schooling are all really, really bad. No group has fallen further faster, according to Scott Galloway, which is very true. But in that truth is also the implication that no group has had so far to fall. So to some extent, maybe these young men or boys aren't doing much worse than a lot of other cohorts, but they also have a higher expectation set upon them by society, ingrained in them from birth, that they should be out-achieving everybody, and they're not. So that gap is particularly part of the problem, right? This is the expectation gap. And there's a few components to this. Ezra Klein has a great podcast about how men are falling behind. There's a lot in there about structural disadvantages of our schooling systems. So a lot of this has to do with the fact that boys tend to develop a few years behind girls. I'd encourage you to check that out because education is a big part of this. We talked a little bit before about this scaffolding that young boys need to develop this character and identity and purpose and the skills they need to succeed and be a part of the world. So this is definitely a big part of it. There is less activity within and outside of the home, outside of schooling. So schooling is becoming more important. This is definitely an area I think we need to focus. We also alluded to this masculine context of men as a provider protector, combined with this prevailing concept of male privilege, which establishes a really high bar for men to reach. And it is internalized in a lot of men. And it's also something that they face, whether it's on the dating scene or anywhere in their personal life. It's also external pressure, expectation to be able to achieve something just because you're a man. And it's one that society doesn't enable young men to overcome nearly as much as it's used to. And I'm not even saying that's necessarily a bad thing. We also talk about this concept of white male privilege to combat the outsized impact of that. In previous decades, we've gone through feminism. We've gone through a lot of work with DEI, and I'm not saying we've erased the multi-generational damage that's been done in some of these areas. I'm not saying it's an equal road in all cases right now, but it is a lot more equal than it used to be. So it is a fact that society doesn't enable young men to overcome or reach this very high bar as much as they used to. And again, this gap between the expectation and the reality for a lot of young men today is significant, leading back to this type of protest masculinity that we refer to as toxic masculinity these days. If I can't achieve as a provider protector, I can certainly be more aggressive. I can certainly be more dominant over women, and this is how I can express my masculinity. I think the final point I want to allude to here about men falling behind is this lack of proactive support. Again, society, having rightly focused on advancing women's rights and opportunities, has been slower to recognize and address the unique challenges faced by boys and men, which leads to a lack of resources and support tailored to their needs. So how do we view masculinity? How do I view these different traits or characteristics? I think first, to call back to the original point of masculinity being a variety of positive character traits, much of this does pertain to women just as much as men. Courage, leadership, and more represent the best of humanity, not just masculinity. With that, let's dive in. The first is strength. And I think obviously here we want to talk not just about physical, but mental as well. There's a lot of emphasis on physical strength these days with younger men and men in general. And I think that can be healthy. And it's also an area where it turns into some of the competition. I have lower body fat, my numbers in terms of bench pressing, and that's fine. That's all well and good. That's part of it. Physical strength is still an area where men traditionally have an advantage over women, where there are still some jobs and some roles that require a certain amount of physical strength that men are more well suited for. But I think we'd be remiss to not also talk about mental strength in addition to physical strength. This is the kind of resilience, and it kind of blends in with some other topics we'll talk at more length about in terms of emotional restraint or emotional capabilities. So leadership. Not everyone can be the leader, but at the same time, leadership isn't a title. It's not a job. It's not an elected office, right? It's a matter of having vision, of knowing the direction to take to move towards that vision, and the inspiration to motivate people to go in that direction. Everybody knows people, right? And everybody, even alone in a room, are with people because everyone is a person. So it can start with everyone being able to lead themselves. True leadership always starts with the self. If you can't lead yourself, how can you lead anybody else? Beyond that, leadership is the ability to guide and influence a group of people towards achieving a common goal. Harkening back to it not being a title, you can display leadership on your job by speaking up when you notice something. There's a million ways you can be a role model for others. Leadership isn't something that you have to be given the ability to do. It's something anyone can do, but it starts with everyone being able to lead themselves. Next, we have emotional restraint. And this is one of the most critical parts that I think we need more mentoring and more focus on. Emotional restraint starts with not reacting to your emotions, right? You don't want to react. You want to respond. You want to avoid being driven by the immediate passion of the moment without a thought. It's not denying emotions, and this is where some of this misguided viewpoint on Stoicism is all about denying and suppressing your emotions. If you're curious about this, I'd skip everyone else and go straight to Ryan Holiday, who I consider the expert on Stoicism. And he can help set people straight on this one. So emotional restraint isn't simply denying your emotions. Often denied pain comes out as anger and depression, right? And this is where we see these problems with young men today with angry outbursts and violence and getting in trouble and depression leading to suicide and drug abuse and more. We need to mentor and teach more emotional restraint, which is accepting your emotions, but not letting them run your life. Rather accepting them and working through them to make a skillful response. Right? This is definitely a core component of leadership. You need to have emotional restraint in terms of skillful response to your emotions, not a gut reaction. I think an important part of emotional restraint that's been lost, I think Sasa mentioned this starting in the 50s and 60s with the rise of feminism and multiculturalism, as that threatened certain people and certain elements that were representing masculinity started to give the wrong idea on emotional restraint. We somehow lost this concept of chivalry and honor. And I would include this in emotional restraint, in that chivalry is this restraint where maybe you have, you could be dominant over this woman, but you honor and respect their humanity enough to restrain your base emotion or your base desire to express your dominance. This concept of honor Maybe I beat you in a competition. We had our conflict, we had our war, and I don't have honor, and I just want to completely destroy your society, or I want to mock your school. There's no real honor in that. There's no emotional restraint. Again, that's this celebration of your victory. This is the going too far with competition, going far beyond virtue to vice on the golden mean, and losing all sense of honor. So to some extent, I would include somehow bringing back this concept of chivalry and honor as part of emotional restraint. Next, we have courage, which is dependent on emotional restraint. Again, like a lot of these are. Again, I think this is very a key piece to focus on. But emotional restraint in the face of fear, right? If you're courageous, you should have the ability to think clearly under pressure. Again, you're restraining your fear enough that you can focus on the facts and what's important so that you can prioritize values and goals over immediate comfort. Again, calling back to the golden mean, we need to clarify the full range of what we think is courage, from cowardice, which is an unhealthy deficiency of courage, to recklessness, which is an unhealthy excess. Beyond enhancing our view of emotional restraint, we need to offer opportunities to experience that value of sacrificing comfort over the short term for long-term goals. We need to provide the ability for young people and people of any age. You don't have to be still a teenager to develop these virtues or character traits, but we need to find ways to provide people the ability to have pressure and face their fears with enough support to succeed. Competitiveness and dominance, right? Competition is good. Competition drives us to be and do better. It helps us figure out who is the fastest, who is the strongest. It gives a reason for people to strive to reach these goals, to make a world record. Winning should be rewarded. I'm not a fan of participation trophies, but there's also room for honoring the courage to compete as well, right? I think this is again an element of emotional restraint to honor the competitors that don't win for having the courage to compete, and that grows their courage, right? You don't have to give them the impression that they're as fast as the other person or as stronger as the other person, but you can honor the fact that they were courageous enough to compete, knowing that they probably weren't the fastest or strongest in the first place. When we talk of competitiveness, we should shine the spotlight on the truest measure of growth. Competition with one's past self. You're not always going to be in a structured competition where you're competing against other people, but every single day you can measure yourself. Every single day you can take that measurement and use your past performance as a guide of how am I competing against my past self? Am I growing? Am I doing the right thing? Am I on the right path? On that same note, I think the healthiest perspective on dominance is dominance over yourself, which is mainly a compound of emotional restraint, courage, and consistent self-leadership. For independence and self-sufficiency, this is one that I see needs some change as well. The change in society and culture has fundamentally removed the option of old ways of true independence. We're all dependent on each other at this point. We all benefit from social structures. Very few of us have the ability to acquire land cheaply and live off of it completely independently. Even at that point, you're still within a nation that has a military that's protecting you from other nations. Nobody on the planet is truly independent. The new ideal application here should speak to doing your part. You may not be able to be independent, but you can pull your weight. Too much emphasis on strict self-sufficiency isn't good because it's a myth that undervalues contributions to the whole and how much we all depend on them. So I think the shift here with independence and self-sufficiency is more pulling your weight. Provider, protector. So this is similar to independence. Our view of provider and protector needs some adaptation. As times change, the type of work most readily available to provide income for a family has shifted towards and away from traditional male jobs. Providing shouldn't be viewed strictly as a food on the table or money in the bank affair. Men can stay home and provide their share of labor, meet their trait of modern independence or self-sufficiency. As a protector, there's always the specter of need for immediate physical protection against threats, though that isn't the only avenue to fulfill the role of protector. In an increasingly interdependent world, families and communities need protections from all kinds of threats. You can be an activist, a volunteer, and do any number of duties to protect the rights of your family and community that don't rely on physical altercations. In fact, I'd argue a majority of providing and protecting fits in this category. So how do we practice this? Benjamin Franklin started a project in his youth. His goal was to achieve moral perfection. Didn't achieve it, but he tried, and that's good. He believed that by systematically practicing these 13 virtues, he could eliminate his faults and live a more upright and successful life. And he had this system for tracking his progress. He had this little book. There's a page dedicated to each virtue. Each page had 7 columns for the days of the week and 13 rows for the virtues. So each week, he would concentrate on one virtue, giving it his strict attention throughout the day. So whatever the virtue was for that week, he kept it in his mind, likely meditated or thought about it at the beginning of the day, like, I'm going to make sure that I focus on this virtue all day long. Every day in the evening, he'd review his day and he'd make a small black mark in this grid for every time he failed in the virtue of the week. He would mark any failures in the other virtues because he was still tracking how well he was doing with those, although his primary focus during the day was to do his best on that virtue of the week. And then after 13 weeks, he would have focused on each virtue once. He'd repeat the entire cycle. So there's gradual improvement here, and this is the only way to improve at anything. And also there's this concept of focusing on one thing at a time. You can't improve your virtuousness in any of these character traits. You can't do them all at the same time. So what I would recommend is to just focus on one at a time and gradually strengthen your habits and weaken their opposites. And the tracking is more to help you understand, even when it wasn't the week to focus on that you still, like if this week you're focusing on your courage, you still need to worry about independence and self-sufficiency, but your first goal is courage. So that's how I would recommend practicing something like this, is to set up a simple system where you cycle through the different character traits that you want to work on and track them. Maybe do some writing on them or some extra time reading about how you can practice those, but just focus on one virtue or character trait at a time. So beyond individual practice, how do we foster these as a society? In older societies, there was a lot more male initiation rituals that helped with some of this type of bridging from being a boy into a man and almost going through some type of ego death or ritualized death. I think there's still some of that in society, in sports. I know that really it's this concept of role modeling and mentorship. I know I've done my part through my children. And volunteering I've done, whether it's Cub Scouts, again, coaching in sports. I've tried to instill these character traits in kids and drop nuggets and be an example of what these traits are and how I act. And I think there's still a call for a lot of that. So much more education and so much more time is spent in school. Our schools don't really focus on these types of things. I think there's some room to do that. I think there's probably some reaction from some people that would like to see religious schools, where religious schools sometimes focus on positive types of character traits. We don't necessarily need it to be religious to be able to focus on these things. I think they are things we can teach and probably make sense to teach. A lot of what we teach nowadays is somewhat outdated, given the technology we have. Yes, it's still good to learn how to do math manually and not just use calculators. There's a level of thinking that needs to happen there, but there should be room to teach these types of skills throughout our education system. Likewise, teaching social and emotional skills. I mentioned multiple times how important proper emotional intelligence and social intelligence is in being a leader, in being courageous, in understanding as a leader what the right thing to do is, what our long-term goals and directions we should take on. There's immense amount of space to do this in school, and it's not good just for jobs, because I know traditionally schooling is meant to prepare people to work. I don't think that's necessarily the healthiest complete vision, right? We need to teach people how to be citizens in society, because there is a cost to not developing people properly in school. People don't have as much time as they used to, with both parents working most frequently, to be able to do an adequate job of being a role model and teaching this type of thing. I think there's a ton of room to be able to do this and school and more after school programs, getting your kids involved in the type of Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, Boys and Girls Club. Volunteering in these things is definitely needed to make that happen as well. I still like the idea of some level of mandatory community service, or even the option to enter into a community service where it's a paid capacity, where you're working in a community that can be structured to help teach people some of these things as they're transitioning. Maybe it's a part of high school, much like they've got work programs that you can enter in while you're going to school. I think there's tremendous opportunity for community service there that will not only help instill these values and character traits in people, it will do good for the community, and it will help them understand the value of community and see the value of their community, and probably cherish more what they have and not take it for granted. I think honoring the good you see is also a good way to foster it. I know it happens. There's a lot of it out there. Probably notice more of the negative, where we're calling out negative traits or examples, toxic masculinity. By all means, maybe it's an exercise you do yourself to make sure, if you're saying one thing negative, go out there and honor something good that you see as well. So more of that is circulated, because what we see is what we will repeat. And we need to see more good examples. I'd like to see more good examples being raised up out there than negative examples being criticized. In that same vein, I would also say you should be critiquing with honor, or we should be critiquing with honor. Are we looking to score some imaginary social status by dunking on someone? Or are you looking to provide valuable feedback or critique? While you're at it, let's not be lazy. Masculinity is a broad topic, right? If we just call it out as bad masculinity, that's kind of weak. An action or a character trait should be judged on that relevant character trait. This is a bad example of courage. This is a bad example of competitiveness. Be specific. Call out something for what it is. People are much, whether it's the person that did the wrong or somebody else viewing your critique, they're going to get a lot more out of it if you critique it very specifically, instead of simply labeling it a lack of masculinity or toxic masculinity. And if you're not sure how you can do that, maybe the best advice comes from Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century AD. You always own the option of having no opinion. There is never any need to get worked up or to trouble your soul about things you can't control. These things are not asking to be judged by you. Leave them alone. In pursuit of a better world, both our actions and our words matter. Wield them both wisely in gathering allies in the struggle to more firmly secure our rights. If you aren't sure how to foster healthy masculinity, start with watering the seed. If you aren't sure how to foster healthy masculinity in society, start with watering the seeds of those positive character traits in yourself, and avoid watering the seeds of negative character traits in others. Until next time, thanks for listening.